This afternoon, the A.J. Williams Myers African Roots Center is hosting Who is Claudia Jones? Lessons to be Learned from a Black Woman Communist, presented by Ethan Scott Barnett as part of our Real History series and Women's History Month Kingston. Claudia Jones is recognized as one of the most influential women in the United States Communist Party. Jones's life demonstrates the importance of and need for a Black international revolutionary movement. Born Claudia Cumberbatch, she became a communist political activist, feminist, and Black nationalist in the US, adopting the name Jones as self-protective disinformation. This program will highlight Jones's contributions to the global freedom struggle and how current organizers can learn from them. Ethan Scott Barnett is a filmmaker, organizer, and cultural worker who follows in the footsteps of Lorraine Hansberry, Claudia Jones, and Marlon Riggs. For the past 10 years, Ethan has been participating in the anti-capitalist movement to heal, support, love, and cherish Black folks. Ethan uses film, theater, and performance to demonstrate the ways African-descended peoples have survived and thrived throughout history. Born and raised in Accord, Ethan is a board member at the African Roots Center and point person for the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative. I am pleased to introduce Ethan Scott Barnett.
Hey y'all, thank you everyone thank you everyone for attending my talk. My name is Ethan Barnett and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Just a reminder to please turn off your screens and turn off your microphones while we go throughout this presentation. Before we take the time to think about the importance of Black revolutionary women and the impact that they have on our society, I would like to thank and acknowledge Women's History Month Kingston and all that they do to celebrate the diversity and contributions of people who identify as women. I would also like to thank the folks at the A.J. Williams Myers African Roots Center. They have been my intellectual home for the past 3 years and always show me encouragement to expand my research on the Black freedom struggle. I'd also like to thank Ted for being the program extraordinario who has helped produce this program digitally. And also thank you to everyone who has taken out of the time to be here today. It is beautiful out in most of the world, especially on the East Coast. And I'd probably be outside if it was up to me, if I wasn't presenting today. I also want to encourage you to think about how Claudia Jones throughout this presentation would react to the events that we're faced with today, right? Absolute and unapologetic white supremacy is floating through every country. There is a deep reoccurrence of colonialism in action. And I just want to think about like, what does an abolition movement look like with Claudia Jones' spirit running through us? So I'm going to take the time to pull up my screen and share. Ooh. Move to present. Okay. I'm also gonna, for the sake of I'm gonna hide myself just for the sake of visuals. Right. So who is Claudia? So who is Claudia Jones? Lessons to be learned from a Black woman communist. Before we move forward, I want to thank and respect to everyone who has done work on Claudia Jones prior to this presentation. I'd like to put a disclaimer that 95% of what I'm going to tell you comes from Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones by Dr. Carol Bois Davies, and Claudia Jones, Beyond Containment, an autobiographical reflections, essays, and poems edited by Dr. Carol Bois Davies. There are also a number of digital publications by Denise Lin of the published on the African American Intellectual Historical Society's blog, Black Perspectives, in which I draw information from. On the left, you can see Davies' 2007 publication, Left of Karl Marx, which has been crucial in rewriting Jones's life into the mainstream and allowed us to re-envision what Claudia Jones looks like at the center of the freedom struggle. Left of Karl Marx is a biographical study in which Davies undertook a 10-year journey to establish an archive built on oral histories, FBI files, and papers literally flying off a bicycle to write and publish a book that has filled a significant hole in the Black radical tradition. With all that said, let me introduce and reintroduce for some of you to Claudia Jones. Claudia was born Claudia Cumberbatch on February 21st, 1950 in the Belmont neighborhood of Port of Spain, Trinidad. At the age of 8, her family migrated to the United States in 1924, and they become residents of New York City's Black Mecca, Harlem. In a letter dated 1965, Jones writes to the Communist Party USA's National Chair, William Z. Foster, on her childhood. As a child of 8, I came to the United States from Port of Spain, Trinidad, British West Indies. My mother and father had come to this country 2 years earlier in 1922, when their economic status, which were middle-class landowners on my mother's side and hotel owners on my father's side, had been worsened as a result of the drop in the cocoa trade on the world market. From the West Indies, which had impoverished the West Indies and the entire Caribbean, like thousands of West Indian immigrants, they hoped to find their fortunes in America, where gold was to be found on the streets, and they dreamed of rearing their children in a free America. Right. So at this point, when Claudia Jones comes to the United States, we see her following the larger path of immigration during the early 20th century. She's part of a movement in which West Indian immigrants are finding their way to the United States via Ellis Island. We also see during this time a large immigration from Ireland, from Eastern Russia, and Italy. Her father, Charles Bertrand Cumberbatch, worked in trades and as a super in several Harlem buildings. This experience was building on his family's operations in Trinidad. And although his family was quite successful in Trinidad, he's faced with serious hardships and a lack of experience within the United States boundaries. His dedication, though, from Trinidad to organizing efforts around housing issues would inspire Claudia throughout her life. Sybil Cumberbatch, her mother, was a garment worker, and due to the effects of harsh working conditions and overwork, she would actually end up dying at 12 years old. So this is another pattern that we see within women's labor during this period, where they're manipulated and forced to work long hours in order to survive in unkempt conditions, which often led to a lot of fires within warehouses and the destruction, essentially, of all of these families in which sought to follow through with the American dream. Jones is educated at Wadley Secondary School for the Performing and Visual Arts. For those of you who are familiar with New York City, it's on 114th Street. While there, she'll study theater and dance. Her studies will overlap with her earliest organizing efforts, right? So she has arrived from Trinidad, where there's a strong consciousness about Black organizing. They recognize that while they're still being colonized by Britain, there are opportunities to follow in cultural stability, right? And recognizing the power of the Trinidadian spirit. So she joins the Junior NAACP and the Urban League. And these organizations are operating throughout New York, and they give her the opportunity to perform for crowds across Harlem and Manhattan. And for me, right, I believe that this is the earliest documentation of Jones's hybrid identity of mixing art and politics to reach the masses. which will become essential and more obvious as she captures audiences with over 13,000 people while working for the Communist Party. As you can see on the right, we have one of the FBI files that Carol Boyce Davies will actually use to document the timeline seen on the left. And as you can read, a biographical sketch of Claudia Jones as the young Communist League personality revealed that in 1936, she met James Ashford, a Negro young communist leader who introduced her to the Young Communist League and was responsible for her joining the Young Communist League. And on the left is just a survey of the things she's experiencing and thinking about. The 1930 to 35 era is actually when her mother will die. And then in 1935 to 1936, the Scottsboro Boys organizing case will actually galvanize thousands of Black folks across the nation. And Claudia is actually writing for a Black newspaper in her own column, Claudia's Comments. And this allows, and one of the first moments that we see her shining as an author and as a journalist. She becomes editor for Federated Youth Clubs of Harlem and regularly attends political rallies that can be found on the street corners of Harlem, but also in small living rooms, storefronts, gymnasiums. It is an opportunity that Claudia sees the landscapes sees landscapes of personal and public institutions to maximize the effort to get political education to the masses. Okay, so Harlem, right? Ooh, actually, these are out of order. So, are they? What do we got? So these are images of Harlem during this time. On the right, we see a street corner orator. These are possibly what we can envision Claudia Jones listening to as she's on her way to write these columns. And on the left is the peak, right, of the United Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League doing their Nurses Day Parade, which was, this organization was led by Marcus Garvey. And although the 20s were a difficult time for West Indian immigrants, ultimately, Harlem in 1924 was filled with this onslaught of radical political and cultural organization. The UNIA is an organization led by Marcus Garvey, which prided itself on Negro self-determination, right? This is the language of the time. And Marcus Garvey is eventually deported, similar to Claudia Jones's fate, for striving for this self-determination amongst the masses. And as you can see on the left, there was a true sense of militancy in which all of these nurses are wearing their whites. The UNIA flag can be seen in the front view right here. And then also the Black Cross Nurses banner is also seen here. So this was often a normalized situation where you would see thousands of Black people organized in parades to celebrate their self-determination and political consciousness. So the Scottsboro case is crucial to Claudia Jones's politicalization. As I mentioned, in 1935 and 1936, this case becomes it's thrown onto the world stage in part by the Communist Party. So on March 25th, 1931, Charlie Weems, Ozzie Powell, Clarence Norris, Olin Montgomery, Willie Robertson, Hayward Patterson, Eugene Williams, and Andrew and Leroy Wright are 9 unemployed young Black men, right? They're really boys in reality of how we think about manhood and identity. They're illegally riding the rails and they're looking for work. They're moving up and down the South in order to find jobs. They're taken off a freight train at Scottsboro, Alabama, and held on a minor charge. Within the entire train, there are also two white women who are found by the Scottsboro deputies, the same deputies who found the Scottsboro Nine, and pressure them into accusing the 9 youths of raping them aboard the train. And these 9 youths are persecuted for this charge. And the charge of raping white women was an explosive accusation, right? We see this all around the world. It's the same rhetoric that is in Birth of a Nation that's shown at the White House in the earlier 19th century, earlier 20th century. And it's the same rhetoric for why Emmett Till will be killed, in which Black men, Black boys are accosting white women. And within 2 weeks, the Scottsboro boys were convicted and 8 were sentenced to death. The youngest, Leroy Wright, was only 13, and he's sentenced to life in prison. And this case is kind of crucial because the 1930s was the height of the Communist Party organizing in the American South. They were establishing multi-state fights against racism and economic exploitation. They immediately took the case on and sparked a mass defense movement. The case would spark political consciousness across the South. In Alabama, a man by Raymond Parks is mobilizing funds for the support to support the case, right? A volunteer by the name of Rosa McCauley signs up. The two will form a deep bond and marry in 1932. 22 years later, the Montgomery bus boycott will be launched by Rosa Parks, Raymond Parks' husband, right? So this moment is what we could see as Michael Brown's death, Sandra Bland's murder, Tamir Rice, the number of murders that have sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. We could also see this in relation to the women who were just murdered in Atlanta. We could see this in conversation with the uprisings around the globe against United States-backed coups. This is not something that's isolated, but it's a moment throughout history that will repeat itself and galvanize the masses. Right, so the Scottsboro case takes place from as far as people from Claudia Jones to Raymond and Rosa Parks will be galvanized by this moment. This is not something that is just singular. This is really a national effort, and it's led by the Communist Party. So the case takes place from 1931 to 1937. And while these boys and their supporters will actually reject the Communist Party's help for its reputation, they would eventually accept their support when they realized that organizations like the NAACP were less enthusiastic about pushing the case forward because of the optics. The Communist Party, using their team of lawyers, aka the International Labor Defense, a legal advocacy organization that defended the rights of political prisoners from 1925 to 1947, takes on the case. So these were also people who were fighting deportation and in fact created, right, by the Soviet Union and their branch of, or I would say their leadership in terms of the Communist Party and its position in the United States. Finally, in 1937, the case went to the United States Supreme Court and the lives of the 9 boys were saved, although it's 20 years before the last defendant was actually freed from prison. And I imagine this is the multiracial movement that Claudia Jones sees and is immediately inspired by, right? Because throughout her life, we'll see her organize across racial, class, and gender lines. And it, foreshadowing the movement in which Martin Luther King says an injustice anywhere. Injustice anywhere is an injustice. Okay, I'm butchering that quote. If anyone remembers it, they can totally throw it in the chat. So this is kind of the moment that we see Claudia's politicalization maximize across these intersections. So thinking about Claudia's political growth, right, I'm going to quote her as much as possible because I think her words really set the stage and allow us to envision what she's thinking at different times. But just to preface this, the Scottsboro case was on the CP's Communist Party's radar because of the Comintern, the Communist International Party, which had adopted the Black Belt Nation thesis in 1928, which enacted the International Communist Pledge to fulfill the Marxist proposition that no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. It's essentially articulating a socialist promise that all people, creed, color, gender, ethnic identity will be seen as equals in terms of the liberation against the West's colonial and capitalist state. And here Claudia Jones pushes back or pushes the Communist Party forward when she says in her article on the right to self-determination for Negro people in the Black Belt, Jones pushes the party to rethink its strict class analysis and argue that race and gender were integral components in class oppression, and therefore any revolutionary identity would take these into account. In a letter to William Z. Foster, she writes of her youth activism during the Ethiopian War. So this is as early as documentation that I could find of her politicalization. This is a direct quote from her. "These were the years of the Ethiopian War and the invasion of Mongolia. During this period, 1935 to 1936, I worked on a Negro nationalist newspaper with a circulation of about 4,000 to 5,000 copies, where I wrote a weekly column called Claudia's Comments. My job consisted there also of writing summaries of the main editorial comments on Ethiopia from the general commercial press, the Negro press, the trade unions, etc. And what happens and why Claudia ends up leaving this nationalist newspaper, and I think why she doesn't give its name, is because the director and the head editor will actually plagiarize her speeches and move move thousands and thousands of people into applause without crediting her. So Jones's politics radically influenced the Communist Party with their stance on gender equality. In an article from 1949, Jones writes about the relationship between Marxist-Leninism and their relationship to women's liberation in her essay, "We Seek Full Equality from Women." Here Jones writes, "Under capitalism, the inequality of women stems from exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, but the exploitation of women cuts across class lines and affects all women. Marxism views the women question as a special question which derives from the economic dependence of women upon men. This economic dependence, as Engels wrote over 100 years ago, carries with it the sexual exploitation of women, the placing of women in the modern bourgeoisie family as the proletariat of the man who assumes the role of the bourgeoisie." Right, so she continues on, "Hence, Marxist-Leninists fight to free women of household drudgery. They fight to win equality for women in all spheres. They recognize that one cannot adequately deal with the woman question or win women for progressive participation unless one takes up the special problems, needs, and aspirations of women as women." And I think here, Jones's philosophy and her articulation of the support and the freedom and liberation of women is mostly tied to what today Kimberly Crenshaw has recognized as intersectional feminism. Jones is writing a perspective where she is a Black woman communist born in Trinidad, coming from a working class background. These intersections of identity regularly influence and impact her politics and those around her. Within these photos, we see Jones speaking and in conversation with a number of, I would say, a number of notable intellectuals and organizers. In the center, we see Claudia Jones and W.E.B. Du Bois. Many of you will know that W.E.B. Du Bois has probably the longest life of a Black organizer, and centers and evolves from a really Black bourgeoisie aesthetic, starting in 1901 when he developed the NAACP with a number of organizers, and moved toward, throughout his lifetime, a Pan-Africanist socialist identity of politics, which sought a hybrid of socialism for all through a Black lens. He will die in Ghana on the anniversary of the March on Washington. So for me, this image represents not only a Pan-Africanist ideology, but a generational acknowledgement in which Black liberation has no boundaries. Both, W.E.B. Du Bois dying in Ghana 3 years later, and Claudia Jones, someone who is born in Trinidad, has a considerable amount of 20 years of activism in the United States, and moving or being deported to Britain also represents that there are no bounds to Black liberation. On the right, we have the All-African Women's Freedom Movement, right? African Women's Day. This is not African American Women's Day, but this is centered in the African women's liberation struggle. And it's dated 1961, December 1961. And during this time, Africa is fighting a strong and irreversible liberation movement, in which the 60s, I think we see 53 of the African countries fight for their liberation, and most of them get it. Most obviously, South Africa does not into the 90s, but most of them will receive their freedoms by means of radical revolution led largely in a guerrilla movement by women across the countryside. And within that photo, at the mic, we see African anthropologist, author, actress, and civil rights organizer Eslanda Good Robeson. As many of you know, her husband is Paul Robeson. And we see Long Live Lumumba, who will be murdered by the Belgian government soon after he becomes prime minister. And they're calling for a socialist policy. They're calling for the eradication of unemployment and poverty across Africa. These are really, really bold, radical ideas in 1960 because Africa has just become free, and they're recognizing that socialism is the only way forward. And lastly, we see Jones on the international stage in Japan, in which she toured with the Communist Party. This photo is undated, so I'm not completely sure at what point it's happening, but sometime between 1955 and 1964. Here we have her FBI surveillance file. And this file is kind of crucial for Carol Boyce Davies' book, Left of Karl Marx, because the FBI was so dedicated and relentless with documenting Claudia Jones's organizing efforts and life. So the FBI starts surveilling Jones as early as 1942, when she becomes the educational director of the Young Communist League. Prior to that, she was the New York State chair and national council member of the Young Communist League, and attends the National Council of Negro Youth. the Southern Negro Congress, and she is a part of the National Council of Negro Youth, the Southern Negro Congress, and the National Negro Congress. In 1942, the same year that the FBI will start surveilling her, she applies for United States citizenship and is denied. The FBI file on Claudia Jones is 870 pages long. That's roughly 1 mile of pages from edge to edge. And as we look through her files, and I encourage everyone to go to the FBI's vault and search her name, because these are really incredible, detailed documents. On the left, you see the Parole Commission, which will come up later on in Claudia's life when she's in prison, and it looks at her relationships and her ability to write in shorthand and Spanish. In the center, we have just a memo in which we see Claudia Jones lying about her identity, which was common for Communist Party members. And these are also a record of which she starts going by Claudia Jones instead of Claudia Cumberbatch. And then on the right, we have an image from a Communist Party USA pamphlet in which Jones's identity was, in which a photo was documented and then scanned. So throughout these files, we learn a lot. And what makes her so dangerous is key to her identity. Not only is she writing weekly columns, like I've mentioned before, for a number of publications, but she's also speaking and gaining notoriety within all of the organizations she's a part of. And this is crucial for her work with the Communist Party. For example, in 1945, she becomes editor of Negro Affairs at the Communist Party's Daily Worker, and then she'll be elected a full member of the National Committee of the Communist Party at its annual convention. In 1948, she toured 43 states, giving speeches on the importance of Black women in the Communist Party, encouraging them to join the struggle and build a better world. Many of these states are in the South and go as far as Los Angeles. This radical activity would lead federal and state governments to start coming down on Jones. In 1948, she'll be arrested on the Immigration Act of 1918, but the trial will ultimately be postponed because nobody will testify against her. While out on bail, Jones will tour the South and West, giving speeches as far as Los Angeles. 1950 will be the year that the government finds enough evidence to convict Jones. Her deportation trial starts in February, but in March of 1950, after she's again let out on bail, her Women's Day speech, International Women's Day, and the struggle for race will ultimately be seen as an overt attack on the United States, according to documents. Unfortunately, with limited resources because of COVID and most of the libraries being closed, I've not been able to find that speech online, but if I do find a PDF copy, I'll be sure to send anyone who wants it. Overall, this surveillance will continue and lead to the her final incarceration and eventual deportation. So her deportation is probably one of the most well-known facts about her. From 1949 to 1958, dozens of Communist Party members were tried, some were convicted, and several served prison terms. The cost of the anti-communist movement went beyond the people who were put on trial. If you've ever read or watched documentaries on red diaper babies, you'll know that these families faced harassment, surveillance, job loss, and illness, all while witnessing the constant harassment of their loved ones. We have a lot of children who will come out of this era who are basically stalked from school and encouraged to snitch on their parents. In 1952, the FBI and the federal government steps up their ability to deport folks who are doing what they refer to as overt acts against the United States government when they create the McWarren-Walter Act, also known as the Immigration and Nationality Act. This allowed the deportation of, quote, dangerous, disloyal, or subversive, end quote, persons. Communist Party members who were US citizens were not safe from federal punishment. It was used to revoke Black activist passports if they refused to sign an affidavit claiming they were not members of the Communist Party. For example, I think one of the most popular cases of this period is when Paul Robeson's passport is seized, and it effectively destroys his international career as a performer, singer, and actor. In the fall of 1952, Jones, along with her fellow Smith Act defendants, which can be seen on the photo on the right, will go on trial. Jones is found guilty in January of 1953 and sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in jail with a $2,000 fine. Jones actually isn't released from prison until October 1955, when they make decisions on what will happen and where she will go when she's deported. The Communist Party will attempt to challenge the deportation and secure stay, but Jones's health deteriorated significantly while she was in prison, and she could not continue her legal challenges while surviving in prison. So the question is, where does Jones go? While in prison, Jones will actually be visited by a British intelligence officer. Britain would accept her entrance into England, though the government didn't really welcome her back because of her political affiliations. She's not sent to Trinidad. It was common knowledge that Jones wouldn't return to her native home because Trinidad was still under rule of British officials. They didn't want to send a radical agitator to the colony, where locals of radical trade unions were regularly shutting down the government and island with mass movements, right? So if Jones had gone back to Trinidad, she may have been an unstoppable force and welcomed with open arms. So after 32 years of living in the United States, Jones is deported. Her friends and family saw her off at Ellis Island. A comrade of hers, Mildred Eldman, will actually travel to England with her on the ship the Queen Elizabeth. The FBI follows her onto the ship and to England and watches and makes sure she does not leave her cabin once on the ship. So they literally follow her until she gets to the port. And, you know, Jones's deportation isn't a surprise, but it's still disheartening for her family and for herself and for her larger community and the larger anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-class, bourgeoisie struggle in the United States. And Jones's biographer, Dr. Caleb Bois Davies, writes in Left of Karl Marx that the physical deportation of Claudia Jones also marks, quote, the deporting of the radical Black female subject to an elsewhere outside the terms of normal African-American intellectual discourse in the United States. Thus, we can see how Jones, up until Davies' biography, is essentially ignored from the United States Black liberation movement. Her deportation also represents, why we don't learn about her in history books, why we don't have one of those, chaotic holidays named after her, why, the Communist Party, which is essentially seen as anti-Black today, why the Democratic Socialist movement may not be as integrated, right? Jones is a representation of that. And when we remove her, we allow for a lot of holes in terms of multiracial, multi-class lines to be obliterated. So in 1956, Jones will actually reflect on the deportation in her own words. She writes, "I was deported from the United States because as a Black woman communist of West Indian descent, I was a thorn in their side in my opposition to Jim Crow racist discrimination against 16 million Black Americans in the United States. And my work for redress of these grievances, for unity of Black and white workers, for women's rights, and my general political activity urging the American people to help by their struggles to change the present foreign and domestic policy of the United States. So she's deported to England, but the struggle continues. In Britain, the Stalinized Communist Party refuses to work with her, but this allows her to start organizing with Black Brits. Alongside, with the support of Amy Ashwood Garvey, Jones co-founds, right, that's Marcus Garvey of the United Negro Improvement Association, that is his wife. Jones co-founds one of the first major Black British newspapers, which can be seen on the photo on the right. Originally, it is called the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. The Gazette was founded in March of 1958, and Jones starts publishing the newspaper as a response, right, to racist attacks of West Indians from working class white communities, which would peak in 1958 in Nottingham and lead to the Notting Hill Uprising, where Blacks essentially revolt on the streets, and similar to what we've seen in Minnesota and Louisville in the ongoing movement to acknowledge and abolish the police state in response to the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. But the West Indian Gazette actually becomes a source of information for people interested in an internationalist perspective on racism and anti-imperialism. In doing so, the paper facilitates the development, right, of a British West Indian identity and forges an imagined diasporic political community. The paper was released monthly, and it really struggled to keep its publication deadlines for 3 months consecutively. We also see this paper with no financial backing, so they will be, so most of the writers will work for free, and including Jones, and they'll have jobs on the side in order to sustain their lives. The paper fluctuates in size, but was generally between 18 and 16 pages upon publication. By 1959, the paper had a total circulation of around 10,000 copies per issue. Jones and the paper's contributors intentionally generated symbiotic dialogue with the international Black freedom movement. They were talking about revolution in Ghana. They were talking about Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau as they were seeking out liberation and preparing for their eventually how do I phrase this? Their move away, their freedom from Portuguese colonies. The West Indian Gazette creates a hybrid identity for local and the global struggle, magnifying the struggles facing Black Brits. Historian Kennetta Hammond Perry is quoted saying that this paper gave Black British activists a platform to raise the profile of their campaign and garner the attention of a global audience. The second struggle that Claudia Jones takes on is actually one of the biggest carnivals to this day in the West. It's referred to as the Nottingham Carnival, and it can be, its counterpart would be the West Indian Day Parade in Brooklyn, and the continuous celebrations across the Caribbean and Africa yearly. Jones writes in one of the pamphlets that our carnival symbolizes the unity of our people resident here and all of our many friends who love the West Indies in a brochure. And Jones creates this carnival alongside a talent competition to celebrate West Indies culture and history. The Nottingham Carnival was molded off carnival celebrations in the Caribbean, right? The celebration to address formerly enslaved Africans, in which they formerly enslaved folks throughout the Caribbean in areas of islands, including Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, took elements of pre-colonial celebrations and rebirthed them using hybrid rituals and traditions to find freedom in an abolitionist society, in a post-abolition, in a society where slavery has been abolished. And then to the right, as I mentioned earlier, as to the left, Claudia Jones leading a demonstration in London against the 1962 Immigration Act, which basically banned Black Brits from living in certain boarding houses, neighborhoods, applying for jobs, similar to the segregation laws that existed in the United States up into the late 60s. So Claudia Jones dies on Christmas Eve, 1964, at the age of 49. Folks found her in her flat on Christmas Day. A postmortem declared that she had actually suffered a massive heart attack due to heart disease and tuberculosis, which could be traced back to her life in Brooklyn as a 17-year-old high school student. Her funeral on January 6, 1965 was a large and political ceremony, with her burial plot would actually be selected next to her tomb, left of the tomb of her hero, Karl Marx, who, as you can see in the photo on the left, this is a moment, this is like a very, what Carol Boyce Davies has recognized as a symbolic relationship for Jones's political alignment to Marxism and Leninism. In the center, we have Karl Marx, who is a white man coming from a bourgeoisie background. And to the left of Karl Marx is Claudia Jones, a Black woman from the West Indies who sought a feminist and class analysis. And the symbolism cannot be missed. It is clear. It wasn't the gravestone. The grave was actually went unnoticed for a considerable amount of years. A few select people knew of it as time went on, but the gravestone wouldn't actually be placed there until the early 2000s. And on the right, you can see Malcolm X with a copy of the West Indian Gazette and Claudia Jones's obituary on the front page. I think this photo also represents Malcolm X's consciousness, in which he sought to move to an international framework at the end of his life, where he was organizing across the world in order to pursue, to find African nations that would call for, that would bring the case of genocide against the United States through the United Nations. Right, where do we go from here? Claudia Jones, what have we learned? And I think there's countless things to learn. And I just want to add, this is kind of like a skim coat of Claudia Jones's life. First, the things that come to me is that we must organize societies across social constructs. Intersectional organizing is crucial to sustaining a long-term movement. Secondly, organizations build community, but if an organization doesn't accept you, there's no reason you have to abide by their rules. There are new people always ready to organize around issues that impact you the most. Lastly, geographical boundaries aren't real as long as there's a white supremacist government. There will be violence, sexism, racism, and more. It is crucial to organize with multiple forms of engagement. Jones's ability to write and perform and center art, joy, and protest in the streets remind us that we may not be good at one thing, but we can always use our voice to be heard. And that is it. I'm gonna move. How do I do this? Stop share. Okay. So that's where we're at. I would love all questions, concerns. I don't know if I'm actually being viewed, Traylon, am I?
Yes, you are being viewed, Ethan. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. I'm sure we all appreciate it. I just want to remind people you can drop any questions and comments into the chat. We do have one comment, actually two, but the first one was the Martin Luther King Jr. quote is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Thank you, Zakaya. It's so good to see you.
And then Rev Deli wrote, I love the way you're connecting the dots, documenting the impact of the Black woman, of this Black woman to Black liberation movements.
Thank you.
I think, Ethan, you're actually checking the chat, so.
Yeah, I'm seeing the comments. Yeah, I welcome all comments or questions or critiques or folks who are thinking about the movement of today and how you know, we may encourage folks to organize in the identity. Yeah, so thank you, Dorothy. So what we see from the British Communist Party is they're just not ready or willing to talk about race. The Windrush Generation happened starting in the early 1940s, in which folks from the Caribbean and from Africa start going to Europe, specifically Britain, right? Because Britain's colonizing all of these countries. Ghana, oh, I'm totally blanking, right? But colonizing all of these countries, and they're seeking independence and they're seeking new opportunities. And the British Communist Party still suck in its just class analysis. They're like, why would we talk about race? We're all oppressed. It's just a class struggle. We're all poor. And Claudia's kind of like, I can't, you know, the United States essentially is ahead in that. So the analysis just wasn't there, and they're pretty unaccepting of her. Question, comments. Hello to everyone from Brooklyn College. Hello to everyone who supports the African Roots Center regularly. Shout out to all of you from Women's History Month Kingston for regularly doing the work.
Well, I think it's our lived experience as Black folks, as women. But there are a lot of people who are probably digesting. You gave us a lot of information today.
Yeah, sorry. I kind of ran through a lot. So Francis, this is actually one of my comrades in Los Angeles at the beginning of quarantine started drawing and creating these. And I'm totally blanking, but it is someone from the African independence movement, and I'll try and get that name to you later. And as always, like, support Black trans liberation. If we're not supporting them, we don't, you know, if they're not at the center of our movement, we're never going to seek liberation. Zakaya, Black women in America. Ooh, that's exciting. I think I don't know.
Read it out. So
okay,
that,
sorry, I'm reading the chat. This from Zakaya Joyner. This was amazing to see how you've developed from a student in our Black Women in America course to doing this research and bridging the gap is super cool. So I would also, if any of you are interested in thinking about Black women and Black organizing, I would reach out to Zakaya because she just got into Howard University for the Masters of Social Work program and will probably be leading the fight from DC as we know it. Am I going to, from Rev Deli, am I going to be continuing, am I going to be going to do more with this research? I hope so. There are so many people who have taken up the mantle on Claudia Jones, and I am super excited by her work. I think I'll try and implement her ideas. I think Kingston in general and the larger Hudson Valley would, across all fronts, would, if we started putting more joy in our activism and our organizing, I think it would be helpful. Maybe we should have more parades or parties or celebrations, post-COVID, obviously. But I think that would really help folks out in terms of rethinking how culture and identity could be celebrated. And Anne says, socially oppressed and economically disadvantaged. The duality is as old as the struggle. Absolutely. And Anne Ames is also the lead organizer of Wednesday Walk for Black Lives, and she has kept the movement alive for the past year. I am so impressed by her organizing. We cannot, you know, we can't move forward without acknowledging kind of what Anne Ames just said, that like this struggle is as old as time. Da-da-da. Sheila asked, what was the relationship of the British Communist Party generally to the West Indian population in Britain? Ooh, I know very little about that, but from what I gathered, I don't think there were actually, was actually anyone of West Indian descent in the British Communist Party, which I guess, you know, speaks volumes, considering in the United States, there was the Black Belt policy that sought across the United States and especially in the South to liberate Black people as best they could in support of it, the movement. So I would, you know, I think that the British Communist Party just really wasn't there, but I do not have enough research to speak further on that.
I think the Communist Party in the United States aligned with African Americans, Blacks in the United States because of the shared oppression as a result of slavery and the continuation of slavery even after the 13th Amendment. So they had shared values which caused them to want to align, formally align in a very deliberate manner.
I love that.
If there are no more questions or comments, I would invite Ethan to give us some closing remarks.
Yeah, I would honestly thank you everyone for showing up. Again, it is a beautiful day and we all have things going on in our life. We're all really, you know, I know most of us are shook by the murders in Atlanta. I know a lot of us are frustrated with and financially unstable by the lack of government support on local, federal, and judicial levels. And I just want to thank you all for showing up and supporting Women's History Month Kingston and the African Roots Center. And hopefully we can continue this conversation in person, online. If you have any questions about Claudia Jones or more, I would really recommend like looking her up. I would recommend getting Left of Karl Marx. That book is amazing. It's basically a book written with FBI files in celebration of Black women, which is like very hard to do. I'd like to thank Troy Ellen Dixon for always holding it down across multiple organizations in Kingston, and taking time out of her very busy schedule to do this with me. Yeah, Brooklyn College fam, Kingston fam, everyone, thank you for showing up today. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Ethan, for an incredible program. Truly appreciate it. I think it gave people a lot to think about today and tomorrow.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.